Welcome to The Explainer. 10 years ago, the UK hit a massive, truly historic crossroads. June 23rd, 2016. That's the day 17 million people decided, you know what? It's time to completely change course. Today, we're doing a deep dive. We're going to objectively break down the hard economic reality of the UK, a full decade after that monumental vote. We're leaving the politics at the door, and we're focusing strictly on the data. So let's just jump right into the big, provocative question on everyone's mind, right? Was Brexit a disaster? To actually answer that without all the spin, we really need to put those high-level 2016 campaign promises right up against the cold, hard statistics of today. We're talking rhetoric versus reality. Think back to 2016. 17 million voters rallied behind one core, incredibly powerful idea: take back control. It was this promise of a stronger, completely autonomous nation, totally free from Brussels and all its regulations. The message was simple but effective. The UK was supposedly being held back from its true economic potential. Which brings us to Section 1, the red bus promise: expectation versus macro reality. Okay, we literally cannot talk about 2016 without mentioning the most famous symbol of the entire campaign, that big red bus. The claim plastered right on the side was absolutely irresistible. It promised that stopping payments to Brussels would inject £350 million back into the National Health Service every single week. But as the UK's own statistics authority pointed out even back then, that was a gross figure. It completely ignored the financial rebates, the funds the EU actually returned, and the local programs that Brussels directly financed. Now, it's true the UK government did eventually increase NHS funding. But how? By raising taxes, jacking up public debt, and cutting other departments. That money came straight out of the pockets of British taxpayers, not from some magical European savings. And wow, does this ever perfectly illustrate the glaring gap between that $350 million promised and the actual losses. Because of the massive new trade friction, the total UK economy is now estimated to be somewhere between 4 and 8% smaller than it would have been otherwise. Now, a smaller overall economy means a much smaller tax base. When you actually compare the numbers, that resulting drop in total GDP translates to an eye-watering £850 million weekly loss in tax revenue. Let that sink in. Instead of saving $350 million a week, the country is effectively bleeding more than double that amount in lost weekly revenues. Let's look at how this plays out on the ground in Section 2, bureaucracy and small businesses, the day-to-day reality. We really need to look at the massive bureaucratic impact all of this had on small businesses. How did that macro-level loss trickle down to the micro-level? Well, it completely transformed the dream of frictionless, independent trade into a pretty harsh day-to-day reality. Take a company called Eskimo. They're a Bristol-based startup that designs these highly efficient radiators. Pre-Brexit, selling to France was just as easy as selling to London. In 2020, a solid 40% of their exports went straight to Europe. But fast forward to 2025, and that figure has absolutely plummeted to just 5%. The crucial takeaway here is that while politicians were busy cheering about a zero-tariff trade agreement, a completely unsustainable mountain of bureaucracy quietly took its place. For a small business like Eskimo, just trying to send a single radiator across the channel turned into this brutal obstacle course. We're talking endless shipping delays, crippling additional costs, piles of extra customs documents, and totally rigorous checks. For European buyers, purchasing from the UK just became way too much of a headache. And the saddest part? Eskimo is definitely not an isolated case. Between 2019 and 2023, more than 16,000 British companies completely stopped exporting to the European Union. 16,000! The vast majority of those were small businesses. They simply could not afford to hire the extra staff or invest the crazy amount of time required for these massive new certification processes. They were quite literally priced out of their closest market by red tape. Moving right along to Section 3, the EU export collapse, shifting the trade landscape. When we zoom out and explain this drastic reduction in exports to the Union on a national level, the macro data is incredibly stark. By 2025, total British exports to the EU had drastically fallen by 14% compared to 2019 levels. And imports took a massive hit too, dropping by 10%. Trade is literally the lifeblood of an open economy. When you pinch that artery, everything else just slows down. You can actually see this physical decline with your own eyes at the Channel Tunnel. This place used to be the ultimate symbol of commercial fluidity, but truck traffic there totally plummeted from 1.64 million vehicles back in 2016 down to just 1.16 million by 2025. Guys, that is nearly 500,000 fewer trucks crossing that border over just 9 years. It's staggering. And as a direct result of all this ongoing trade friction, national investments have just stagnated. Now, remember, national investments are the true engine for any future growth, innovation, and job creation. Today, they are hovering up to 18% below their pre-Brexit trajectory. It acts like a drag effect. It doesn't instantly destroy an economy overnight, but man, it weighs it down heavily over the long haul. Which brings us to Section 4, New Deals. Are they enough? Looking outside Europe. Now, right about now, you're probably asking, wait a minute, didn't the UK sign a bunch of new trade agreements outside the EU to make up for all this? Well, yes, it's true. The UK did ink new deals with countries like Australia, New Zealand, and India. But let's evaluate that GDP growth via these new extra EU deals. Official government estimates show these agreements will boost the GDP by a mere 0.6%. Remember that 4 to 8% total GDP loss we were talking about earlier? Yeah, a 0.6% gain is just far too small to offset the massive hit of losing frictionless access to the giant European market next door. And the economic ripples don't stop at trade. We've also seen some really fascinating unintended paradoxes around other massive campaign promises, specifically immigration. A huge goal of the Leave campaign was, of course, to reduce immigration. And sure enough, initially, European immigration dropped sharply. But to handle some pretty desperate labor shortages in sectors like social care, the UK had to implement a new, highly permissive points-based system. The result? That drop in European workers was almost immediately replaced by absolutely record-breaking levels of non-EU immigration. The total numbers actually spiked significantly before some recent severe restrictions were finally put in place. Now, to remain completely fair and objective here, being outside the EU has absolutely opened up some new doors. Unbound by Brussels, the UK now has the total regulatory sovereignty to adopt faster, much more flexible rules in cutting-edge sectors. We're talking artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and digital finance. There are analysts who firmly believe this newfound tech freedom could really position the UK as this nimble, global hub for emerging technologies. It's a massive opportunity. But here we are, 10 years later, with national investments still basically stagnant and thousands of small businesses still drowning in economic friction. We really have to pause and ask ourselves, was the trade-off of giving up that economic access in exchange for regulatory sovereignty actually worth it? Ultimately, what does taking back control truly cost in a deeply interconnected modern global economy? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the data, and I'll catch you in the next one.